In the middle of nowhere,
Contact
where
right
the
to the
desert
left
meets the
side!
sky,
Copy for it!
Sam
Push,
becomes
go!
the worst enemy. 8 of America's most elite warriors found themselves staring death in the face. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were Navy SEALs, trained to handle impossible situations, trained to never give up, trained to always find a way out. But on this day, in the heart of enemy territory, with a sandstorm so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, even they had reached their limit, the radio crackled with desperate voices. We're pinned down. Heavy fire from multiple positions. We can't see anything through this storm. The enemy had them surrounded, and with each passing minute, their ammunition was running dangerously low. Death seemed certain, but sometimes when hope is lost and prayers seem to go unanswered, a guardian angel appears in the most unexpected form. This time, that angel came with a sniper rifle, nerves of steel, and the ability to see what others couldn't. This time, that angel was a woman whose name would never appear in newspapers, whose face would never be shown on television, but whose 27 precise shots would save 8 lives and change military history forever. This is not just a story about war. This is not just another tale of heroism. This is the story of what happens when training meets instinct, when courage meets precision, and when one person's impossible shot becomes 8 people's second chance at life. This is the story of the day the desert learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest gun or the strongest soldier. Sometimes it's the steady hand of someone who refuses to let good people die on their watch. Get ready for a journey into the heart of combat, where every second counts, every bullet matters, and every decision could mean the difference between coming home or becoming another name on a memorial wall. The morning started like any other day in the desert. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun had been awake since 400 hours, running through her daily routine with the precision that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. At 28 years old, she was one of the few female snipers in the United States military, a fact that had earned her both respect and skepticism in equal measure. The forward operating base hummed with quiet activity as soldiers prepared for another day of operations. Chun methodically cleaned her rifle, a customized M24 that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Each component was inspected, each mechanism tested. In her line of work, there was no room for equipment failure. Lives depended on her weapon functioning perfectly every single time. Her spotter, Corporal Martinez, approached with 2 cups of coffee and the morning briefing papers. They had worked together for 18 months, developing the kind of wordless communication that comes from countless hours of shared danger. Martinez was 24 from Texas, with a wife and newborn daughter he talked about every chance he got. "Looks like we might have some action today," Martinez said, settling down beside her on the wooden bench they had claimed as their morning meeting spot. Intelligence reports increased activity in Sector 7. Command thinks they might be planning something big. Chin nodded, taking a sip of the bitter coffee that had become as essential as ammunition. She had learned early in her career that in the military, good coffee was harder to find than enemy targets. What kind of activity? Movement of vehicles, concentration of personnel. The usual signs that someone is up to no good. Martinez spread out a map marked with red circles and arrows. But here's the interesting part. They're not following their usual patterns. Instead of staying in the mountains where they have cover, they're moving into the open desert. Chun studied the map with the analytical mind that had made her one of the most effective snipers in her unit. After years of combat experience, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict enemy behavior. Something about this situation felt different, and different in the desert usually meant dangerous. "Could be a trap," she said, tracing potential sight lines with her finger. "They know we have eyes in the sky. Moving into the open desert makes them sitting ducks unless they have something else planned." The weather reports had been concerning all week. A massive sandstorm was building in the west, the kind that could turn day into night and visibility into zero in a matter of minutes. Chun had experienced these storms before, and they were nature's way of reminding humans how small and vulnerable they really were. At 0800 hours, the briefing began in the main command tent. Major Williams, the commanding officer, stood before a group of 30 soldiers, his weathered face serious as he outlined the day's mission. Intelligence had confirmed that a high-value target was moving through Sector 7, accompanied by a significant force of enemy combatants. "This is what we've been waiting for," Major Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "This individual has been responsible for coordinating attacks against our forces for the past 6 months. We have a narrow window of opportunity to take him out before he disappears in the mountain strongholds where we can't reach him." The plan was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. A team of 8 Navy SEALs would infiltrate the target area under cover of darkness, establish overwatch positions, and wait for the enemy convoy to enter the kill zone. Chun and Martinez would provide long-range fire support from an elevated position approximately 2 miles away. What made this mission particularly challenging was the weather. The sandstorm that had been building all week was now forecast to arrive sometime in the late afternoon. Command had decided to proceed with the mission anyway, gambling that they could complete the operation before the storm made visibility impossible. As Chun prepared her equipment, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. In her experience, enemy forces didn't abandon advantageous positions without good reason. The fact that they were moving into open terrain suggested they either had intelligence about coalition forces' movements, or they had planned something that would neutralize the coalition's technological advantages. The SEAL team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with specific skills and responsibilities. Team leader Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had 20 years of experience and had led more successful missions than anyone in the unit. His second-in-command, Petty Officer First Class Thompson, was an explosives expert who could improvise destructive devices from seemingly innocent materials. The rest of the team included communications specialist Petty Officer Jackson, medic Petty Officer Williams, breacher Petty Officer Davis, machine gunner Petty Officer Martinez, no relation to Chin Spotter, point man Petty Officer Brown, and rear security Petty Officer Johnson. Each man had survived multiple combat deployments and had been selected for this mission based on their proven ability to operate effectively under extreme conditions. At 1,000 hours, the teams began their movement toward the target area. The SEALs would travel by vehicle for the first part of their journey, then move on foot for the final approach to maintain stealth. Chun and her spotter would take a different route, using a modified all-terrain vehicle to reach their overwatch position. The desert landscape was deceptively peaceful as they moved through it. Rolling hills of sand and scattered rocks stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional cluster of vegetation that had adapted to the harsh environment. The sun was already climbing toward its punishing midday position, and the temperature was rising rapidly. Chun had grown up in California, but nothing had prepared her for the brutal heat of desert combat operations. The military gear that protected soldiers from enemy fire also trapped body heat, creating a greenhouse effect that could be as dangerous as any weapon. Proper hydration and heat management were literally matters of life and death. As they traveled, Martinez maintained radio contact with the SEAL team and the command post. Regular position updates and status reports were essential for coordinating the complex operation. Chun used the travel time to study the terrain and identify potential shooting positions, calculating distances and wind patterns that would affect her shots. By 1,200 hours, both teams were in position. The SEALs had established a concealed observation post overlooking the expected route of the enemy convoy. Chun and Martinez had reached their overwatch position on a hill that provided clear sight lines across the entire target area. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The waiting began. In sniper operations, patience was often the difference between success and failure. Chun had learned to control her breathing, slow her heart rate, and maintain absolute focus for hours at a time. Through her high-powered scope, she could see for miles across the desert landscape, watching for any sign of movement. At 1,330 hours, the first reports came in. Enemy vehicles had been spotted moving toward the target area, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The convoy consisted of 3 pickup trucks and what appeared to be a command vehicle, with an estimated 15 to 20 combatants. More importantly, aerial surveillance had confirmed that the high-value target was an elite vehicle. The SEALs reported that they were ready to engage as soon as the convoy entered the kill zone. Chun adjusted her scope and confirmed that she had clear shots of the target area. The plan was for the SEALs to initiate the attack with explosive charges and automatic weapons fire, while Chun provided precision fire support to eliminate any threats that tried to escape or flank the main assault. At 1,400 hours, everything changed. The weather station reported that the Sandstorm was moving faster than expected and would reach their area within 2 hours, not the 4 hours originally forecast. Major Williams faced a difficult decision: abort the mission and lose the opportunity to capture or eliminate the high-value target, or proceed with the operation and risk having his forces caught in the storm. The decision was made to continue. The potential intelligence value of the target was too important to pass up, and command believed they could complete the mission before the worst of the storm arrived. Chun felt a chill despite the desert heat. She had been in enough combat situations to recognize when circumstances were beginning to spiral beyond anyone's control. The convoy appeared on schedule at 1,445 hours, moving slowly through the desert in single-file formation. The lead vehicle matched the description of the target vehicle perfectly, and aerial surveillance confirmed the presence of the high-value individual. The SEALs prepared to initiate the attack as soon as all vehicles entered the kill zone. But as Chun watched through her scope, she noticed something that hadn't appeared in the intelligence reports. The convoy wasn't alone. Additional vehicles were moving parallel to the main group, staying just out of sight behind low hills and rock formations. What they had thought was a simple convoy was actually a much larger force, and the SEALs were about to walk into an ambush. Chun immediately radioed her observations to the SEAL team leader. "Chief Rodriguez, this is Overwatch. I count additional vehicles moving in formation with the main convoy. Estimate 12 to 15 additional combatants in concealed positions. This looks like a trap." Rodriguez's voice crackled back through the radio, calm despite the implications of Chen's report. "Copy that, Overwatch. We see them too. Adjusting plan accordingly. Stand by for execute order." The professional composure in Rodriguez's voice didn't hide the fact that the situation had become exponentially more dangerous. Instead of facing a convoy with 20 combatants, they were now looking at a force of 35 to 40 enemy fighters who had chosen their ground carefully and appeared to be expecting trouble. At 1,500 hours, just as the storm clouds began to darken the western horizon, Chief Rodriguez gave the execute order. The carefully planned ambush began with a series of coordinated explosions that disabled 2 of the convoy vehicles and created chaos in the enemy ranks. The SEALs opened fire with disciplined precision, each man engaging targets according to the predetermined plan. For the first few minutes, everything went perfectly. Chun provided covering fire, eliminating 3 enemy combatants who tried to establish firing positions on high ground. The SEALs moved with the fluid coordination that came from months of training together, advancing by bounds while maintaining suppressive fire. But the enemy had planned their own surprises. As the SEALs pressed their attack, the hidden vehicles revealed themselves and began pouring automatic weapons fire into the kill zone. What had begun as a coalition ambush suddenly became a desperate fight for survival. "We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions." Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, strain evident despite his training. "Requesting immediate fire support on coordinates I'm about to transmit." Chun adjusted her position and began engaging the newly revealed enemy positions. Her first shot eliminated a machine gunner who had the SEALs pinned down behind inadequate cover. Her second shot took out what appeared to be an enemy commander who was coordinating the defensive fire. But even as she picked off individual targets, Chun could see that the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy had achieved numerical superiority and held advantageous positions. Worse, the first wisps of blowing sand were beginning to reduce visibility, and the main body of the storm was still approaching. The battle continued for 20 minutes, with both sides suffering casualties. The SEALs had managed to eliminate the high-value target in the initial assault, but they were now surrounded and running low on ammunition. Chun had expended most of her precision rounds and was down to her last magazine. At 1,525 hours, the Sandstorm arrived with the fury of nature unleashed. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters in a matter of minutes, and the wind began howling with enough force to make radio communication difficult. Both sides were suddenly fighting blind, and the advantage shifted to whoever could adapt most quickly to the changed conditions. Chin found herself in an impossible situation. Through the swirling sand, she could barely make out the positions where she knew the SEALs were fighting for their lives. The enemy had stopped advancing, but they maintained their positions and continued to pour fire into the area where the Americans were trapped. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions from the SEAL team. They were down to their last magazines of ammunition, and several team members had been wounded. Medical evacuation was impossible in the storm, and reinforcements couldn't navigate in zero-visibility conditions. Overwatch, this is Rodriguez. The team leader's voice came through the radio, barely audible over the storm. We are surrounded and running critically low on ammo. Unless something changes soon, we're not going to make it out of this one. Chin stared through her scope into the wall of swirling sand that had swallowed the battlefield. Somewhere in that chaos, 8 of America's finest warriors were fighting their last fight. The storm that was supposed to provide cover for their withdrawal had instead become their death sentence. But Chin wasn't ready to give up. She had 1 magazine left, 27 rounds of precision ammunition. In normal conditions, 27 rounds would be more than enough to turn the tide of the battle. But these weren't normal conditions. She couldn't see her targets, couldn't calculate wind drift, couldn't even confirm that she was aiming at enemy positions rather than friendly forces. As she prepared to attempt the impossible, Chun thought about Martinez's newborn daughter, about Rodriguez's 20 years of service, about the families who were waiting for these men to come home. Sometimes being a sniper meant taking the shot, even when success seemed impossible. Sometimes it meant trusting training and instinct when logic said there was no chance. The storm raged around her as she settled in a firing position, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether 8 heroes lived to fight another day or became another tragic footnote in the long history of military operations gone wrong. The sandstorm had transformed the battlefield into something from another world. What had been a clear desert landscape just 30 minutes earlier was now a swirling wall of brown and gold, with visibility reduced to mere arm's length in some areas. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying sand that stung exposed skin and found its way into every piece of equipment. Chun pressed herself against the rocky outcrop that provided her firing position, trying to minimize her exposure to the driving sand. Her spotter, Martinez, had moved closer to maintain communication, but even shouting directly into each other's ears required effort to be understood over the storm's fury. "I can't see anything through the scope," Martinez yelled, his voice barely carrying the 3 feet between them. "The sand is too thick. How are you going to engage targets you can't see?" It was a fair question, and one that Chun had been wrestling with since the storm had engulfed them. Traditional sniper tactics were based on careful observation, precise range estimation, and calculated adjustments for environmental factors. Everything she had been trained to do required being able to see her targets clearly and identify the difference between enemy combatants and friendly forces. But Chun had spent years developing skills that went beyond the standard military training manual. Growing up hunting in the mountains of Northern California, she had learned to track game in fog so thick she couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Her grandfather, a veteran of the Korean War, had taught her that sometimes successful hunting meant understanding your prey, so well that you could predict their movements even when you couldn't see them. The radio crackled with another transmission from Chief Rodriguez, his voice tight with controlled desperation. Overwatch, we're down to less than 50 rounds total. Enemy forces are maintaining position and continuing to engage. We have 3 wounded, including Thompson, who took shrapnel to the leg. Medical status is becoming critical. Chun closed her eyes and tried to visualize the battlefield as it had existed before the storm. She had studied the terrain carefully during their approach, noting every rock formation, every slight depression, every piece of cover that could conceal a fighting position. The enemy hadn't moved significantly since the storm arrived, which meant they were likely still occupying the same positions they had held when visibility was clear. Martinez, she called to her spotter, I need you to help me reconstruct the battlefield. Before the storm hit, where were the primary enemy firing positions? Martinez pulled out his notebook, which contained the detailed observations they had recorded throughout the engagement. Even in the howling wind, his training took over as he began rattling off coordinates and descriptions. Primary machine gun position was at bearing 270, approximately 800 meters behind the large boulder cluster. Secondary position at bearing 285, 900 meters, using the wrecked vehicle for cover. I counted at least 3 rifles in the Rocky Depression at bearing 290. Chun processed the information, building a mental map of enemy positions. The key was understanding that while she couldn't see her targets, they couldn't see each other either. The storm that was hampering her ability to provide fire support was also preventing the enemy forces from coordinating their defense effectively. Through her headphones, she could hear the increasingly sporadic gunfire from the SEAL positions. Her friends were conserving ammunition, firing only when they had clear targets or when enemy forces attempted to advance. But conservation could only last so long, and Chun knew that once their ammunition was exhausted, the enemy would overrun their positions quickly. The wind shifted slightly, and for just a moment, the wall of sand thinned enough for Chun to catch a glimpse of muzzle flashes in the distance. The brief clearing lasted no more than 3 seconds, but it was enough to confirm that the enemy was still maintaining their primary firing positions. More importantly, it gave her a reference point to work from. I'm going to try something, Chun told Martinez, settling into her firing position behind the rifle. I need you to spot for me and call out any changes in the enemy fire pattern. If I start hitting their positions, they're going to react, and we can use those reactions to identify additional targets. Martinez looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Sarah, you're talking about engaging targets you can't see at ranges where a miss could hit our own people. Are you sure about this? Chun had asked herself the same question, and the answer came down to simple mathematics. If she did nothing, 8 men would die within the next 15 minutes. If she attempted to engage and missed, the worst-case scenario was that she would waste ammunition that couldn't save them anyway. But if she could somehow find her targets in the storm, she might be able to tip the balance and give the SEALs a chance to survive. I'm sure, she said, adjusting her scope to the first set of coordinates Martinez had given her. Chief Rodriguez, this is Overwatch. I'm going to attempt to engage enemy positions using pre-storm coordinates. When I fire, watch for changes in their fire pattern and let me know immediately. Rodriguez's response was immediate. Copy that, Overwatch. We're ready to spot for you. At this point, we'll take any help we can get. Chin's first shot was as much an experiment as an attempt to eliminate a target. She aimed at where the machine gun position had been before the storm, made her best guess at wind adjustment, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and the muzzle flash was immediately swallowed by the swirling sand. For several seconds, nothing changed. The enemy fire continued at the same rate and intensity. Chin began to wonder if she had missed by so much that the enemy hadn't even noticed the shot. But then Martinez grabbed her arm. The machine gun stopped firing, he shouted over the wind. Something happened at that position. Rodriguez confirmed it over the radio. Overwatch, the primary machine gun position has gone silent. Either you hit something, or they're repositioning. Either way, it's giving us some breathing room. Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before moving to her next target. The key was to work systematically through the enemy positions, using sound and the reactions of other enemy forces to confirm hits. It was the most challenging shooting she had ever attempted, but it was also exactly the kind of problem-solving that had made her an exceptional sniper. Her second shot targeted the position behind the wrecked vehicle. This time she could actually hear the impact of the bullet striking metal, followed by a noticeable decrease in the volume of fire from that direction. Whether she had hit a person or just damaged equipment, she had clearly affected the enemy's ability to maintain their defensive fire. "That's two positions compromised," Rodriguez reported, and Chun could hear renewed hope in his voice. "Whatever you're doing up there, keep it up. We're starting to see some opportunities to move." The third shot was the most difficult yet. The rocky depression Martinez had identified was at the extreme range of her rifle, and the wind conditions made accurate fire nearly impossible. Chun took extra time with her calculations, trying to factor in not just the distance and elevation, but also the unpredictable wind patterns created by the storm. When she fired, the bullet seemed to disappear into the wall of sand without any indication of impact. But 30 seconds later, Martinez pointed excitedly toward the target area. "Movement," he shouted. "I can see figures moving away from that position. You spooked them even if you didn't score a direct hit." Chen was beginning to understand that in these conditions, precise kills were less important than disrupting the enemy's defensive coordination. Every shot that forced them to move or take cover was a shot that reduced their ability to pin down the SEALs. She was fighting a psychological battle as much as a physical one. Her fourth and fifth shots targeted suspected sniper positions that had been harassing the SEALs from long range. These are the most dangerous threats because a single well-placed shot could eliminate one of the trapped Americans. Chun put extra care into these engagements, trying to place her shots close enough to force the enemy snipers to abandon their positions. The storm continued to rage around them, but Chun was beginning to develop a rhythm. She would identify a target based on pre-storm observations, calculate her firing solution, shoot, and then wait for feedback from the SEALs about the effectiveness of her fire. It wasn't perfect, but it was working well enough to give the Americans a fighting chance. "Overwatch, this is Rodriguez." The team leader's voice came through with increased urgency. "We've got movement on our left flank. Sounds like they're trying to work around behind us while we're focused on the main positions. Can you do anything about that?" Chun cursed under her breath. The enemy was adapting to her fire, using the reduced visibility to attempt a flanking maneuver that could wipe out the entire SEAL team. She needed to shift her focus to an area of the battlefield where she had no pre-storm reference points and no clear idea of the terrain. "Martinez, what do you remember about the ground to the left of the SEAL position?" she asked. Martinez consulted his notes again, shouting over the wind. "Mostly open ground with scattered rocks. There's a dry creek bed that runs roughly parallel to their position, about 200 meters out. If someone wanted to flank them, that's the route they'd probably use." Chun adjusted her scope toward the estimated position of the creek bed. She couldn't see it, couldn't confirm that enemy forces were actually using it, and had no way to ensure she wouldn't hit friendly forces if the SEALs had moved from their last reported positions. But sometimes being a sniper meant taking calculated risks based on incomplete information. Her sixth shot was aimed at the center of where she believed the creek bed to be. Her seventh and eighth shots bracketed that position, creating a zone of fire that anyone moving through the area would have to cross. She was essentially laying down suppressive fire with a precision rifle, using volume of fire to compensate for the lack of specific targets. "That did it," Rodriguez reported excitedly. "Whatever was moving out there has stopped. We're getting some return fire from that direction, but it sounds like they've gone to ground instead of continuing their advance." Chun was now 1/3 of the way through her final magazine, with 18 rounds remaining. The tactical situation had improved significantly, but the SEALs were still surrounded and the storm showed no signs of letting up. More concerning, Her rifle was beginning to accumulate sand in its action despite her efforts to keep it covered between shots. The ninth shot misfired. Chun pulled the trigger, and nothing happened except for a metallic click that was barely audible over the wind. She quickly worked the bolt action to eject the defective cartridge and chambered a fresh round, but the misfire was a warning that her weapon was beginning to suffer from the harsh conditions. Equipment problems? Martinez asked, noticing her actions. The sand is getting into everything, Chun replied, quickly checking her rifle's action. I've got 17 rounds left, and I can't afford any more malfunctions. She made a mental note to be even more selective with her remaining shots. Every round had to count, not just because ammunition was limited, but because her rifle might not function much longer in the storm conditions. The 10th shot targeted another suspected machine gun position that had been firing in sustained bursts at the SEAL location. Chin's bullet struck something solid, followed by the sound of ricocheting metal and a cessation of fire from that direction. Whether she had hit the weapon, the operator, or just the position itself, she had eliminated another threat. Outstanding shooting. Rodriguez called over the radio. Enemy fire is down to less than half of what it was when this started. We're going to try to consolidate our position and treat our wounded while you've got them suppressed. Chin used the lull in activity to clean sand from her rifle's action as much as possible. The storm was beginning to take a toll on all of their equipment, not just weapons. Radio communications were becoming increasingly difficult as sand worked its way into electronic components, and the constant wind was creating fatigue that affected everyone's performance. Martinez tapped her shoulder and pointed toward the SEAL position. I think I can see some movement down there. Looks like they're trying to regroup while they have the chance. Through brief clearings in the storm, Chin caught glimpses of figures moving among the rocks where the SEALs had taken cover. The fact that they felt confident enough to move suggested that her fire had indeed reduced the immediate threat significantly. But she knew that the enemy forces were likely using the same break in fire to reposition and plan their next move. The 11th and 12th shots were insurance rounds, placed into areas where Chun suspected the enemy might be planning to establish new firing positions. She was beginning to think tactically not just about where the enemy was, but about where they might move next and how to prevent them from regaining the initiative. As she prepared her 13th shot, Chin realized that she was fighting the most unique engagement of her military career. She was essentially conducting a one-woman siege, using precision fire to gradually reduce the enemy's ability to maintain their attack, while giving the SEALs time to reorganize and plan their escape. But time was still working against them. The storm might provide concealment, but it also prevented any possibility of reinforcement or medical evacuation. The longer the engagement continued, the more likely it became that someone would make a fatal mistake or that equipment failures would compromise their ability to fight effectively. Chin settled behind her rifle for the 13th shot, knowing that each trigger pull brought them closer to either salvation or disaster. In the swirling chaos of the sandstorm, 14 more shots stood between 8 trapped SEALs and either rescue or a memorial service back home. Chin's 13th shot rang out into the howling darkness of the storm, and she immediately knew something had changed. The sound of the bullet's impact was different this time, followed by what sounded like shouting in a foreign language. Through the swirling sand, she caught a brief glimpse of figures scrambling for new cover. Direct hit on something important, Martinez observed, trying to peer through the storm with his binoculars. That got their attention in a big way. The enemy's response confirmed that Chun had struck a significant target. Instead of the disciplined, coordinated fire they had maintained throughout the engagement, their return fire became erratic and poorly aimed. Someone important had either been eliminated or forced to abandon their command position. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio with the first genuinely optimistic news of the engagement. Overwatch, enemy fire has become disorganized. We're seeing opportunities to bound forward and improve our position. Whatever you hit, it's disrupted their command structure. Chun allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction before returning her focus to the tactical situation. Disrupting enemy command was a significant achievement, but she still had 14 rounds remaining and 8 men who needed to get out of the kill zone alive. The storm continued to rage around them, and visibility remained at near zero levels. Her 14th shot targeted what she believed to be a secondary command position, based on the pattern of enemy fire before the storm had hit. The bullet disappeared into the wall of sand without any immediate indication of impact, but 30 seconds later, the volume of enemy fire dropped noticeably again. "They're pulling back," Martinez reported, excitement evident in his voice despite the howling wind. "I can hear movement. Sounds like they're repositioning to more defensive positions." This was exactly what Chun had hoped to achieve. By systematically eliminating key positions and personnel, she had forced the enemy to abandon their aggressive posture and adopt a more defensive stance. The SEALs were no longer trapped in a closing vice. Instead, they were facing an enemy that was more concerned with survival than with completing their attack. Rodriguez confirmed the change in enemy behavior. "Overwatch, we're observing a significant reduction in hostile fire. Enemy forces appear to be withdrawing to more distant positions. We're going to use this opportunity to consolidate and plan our extraction." Chen's 15th and 16th shots were placed into areas where the enemy might establish new firing positions during their withdrawal. She was essentially herding them away from the SEAL position, using precision fire to deny them advantageous ground and force them into positions where they would be less effective. The storm had been raging for over an hour now, and Chun was beginning to feel its effects on her body and mind. The constant wind and blowing sand created a sensory overload that made concentration difficult. Her hands were cramped from gripping the rifle, and her eyes watered constantly from the particles that found their way around her protective gear. Martinez was monitoring radio communications from multiple sources, trying to piece together a complete picture of the tactical situation. "Command is reporting that the storm is expected to continue for at least another 2 hours," he shouted over the wind. "Air support and ground reinforcements are impossible until visibility improves." This meant that Chun and the trapped SEALs were on their own for the immediate future. Whatever happened in the next few hours would depend entirely on their ability to outfight and outthink an enemy force that still outnumbered them significantly. Chen's 17th shot targeted a position where she had observed muzzle flashes during one of the brief clearings in the storm. The shot was followed by the distinctive sound of a bullet striking rock, then ricocheting with a high-pitched whine. She had missed the target, but had come close enough to force whoever was there to find new cover. "The enemy is adapting to your fire," Martinez observed. "They're moving more frequently and staying in positions for shorter periods. You're making them afraid to stay in one place too long." This was both good news and bad news. The frequent movement made it harder for the enemy to maintain effective fire on the SEALs, but it also made it more difficult for Chun to predict where they would be when her bullets arrived. She was essentially playing a deadly game of chess where she couldn't see the board clearly and had to guess her opponent's moves. Her 18th shot was placed into an area where logic suggested the enemy might establish a new observation post. Chun was now shooting at possibilities rather than certainties, using her understanding of military tactics to predict where trained fighters would likely position themselves. The bullet struck something metallic, producing a sharp clang that was audible even over the storm. Whether it was equipment, a weapon, or a vehicle, Chen had clearly hit something the enemy valued enough to react to. The response was immediate and violent, with multiple automatic weapons opening fire in her general direction. "They're trying to suppress your position," Martinez warned, pulling Chun lower behind their rocky cover as bullets whistled overhead. "They know roughly where you are now." Chun had expected this development. After 18 shots, even in limited visibility, a competent enemy force would be able to triangulate her approximate position. The incoming fire wasn't accurate enough to be immediately dangerous, but It indicated that the enemy was now devoting resources to neutralizing her rather than focusing entirely on the trapped SEALs. Rodriguez, this is Overwatch, Chen called over the radio. Enemy forces are now engaging my position. Use this opportunity to improve your tactical situation while their attention is divided. The SEAL team leader's response was immediate. Copy that, Overwatch. We're moving now. Chen's 19th shot was her most challenging yet. With enemy forces actively trying to suppress her position, she had to expose herself to return fire every time she aimed and fired. The psychological pressure was immense, knowing that every second spent in a firing position increased the chances of taking a bullet. She aimed at where she believed an enemy machine gun was positioned and fired quickly, ducking back behind cover immediately after the shot. The bullet's impact was confirmed by a sudden cessation of fire from that direction, followed by the sound of voices shouting in what sounded like panic. Excellent shot, Rodriguez reported over the radio. That was the gun that had us pinned down on the left side. We've moved forward 50 meters and are in much better defensive positions now. Chun had 8 rounds remaining in her final magazine. The tactical situation had improved dramatically from the desperate circumstances of an hour earlier, but the engagement was far from over. The enemy still held numerical superiority and controlled much of the surrounding terrain. More importantly, the storm showed no signs of weakening, and extended operations in these conditions were taking a toll on everyone involved. Her 20th shot targeted what she hoped was an enemy sniper position. Individual riflemen were often the most dangerous threats to infantry forces because they could eliminate key personnel with single, well-placed shots. By forcing enemy snipers to abandon their positions or take cover, Chun was reducing the precision threat to the SEALs. The shot produced no obvious result, but absence of return fire from that area suggested that she had either eliminated the threat or forced the sniper to relocate to a less advantageous position. In either case, it was a tactical victory. Martinez had been tracking the engagement's progress on paper, noting the time and estimated effectiveness of each shot. You've been shooting for 90 minutes, he reported. Based on the changes in enemy fire patterns, I estimate you've eliminated or suppressed at least 12 different positions. That's remarkable shooting under any conditions, but in this storm, it's almost supernatural. Chen didn't feel supernatural. She felt exhausted, anxious, and acutely aware that 7 rounds might not be enough to ensure the safe extraction of 8 men. Every shot had to count more than the last, and the pressure of that knowledge was beginning to affect her concentration. Her 21st shot was aimed at a position where she suspected the enemy was trying to establish a new command post. Communication and coordination were critical to any military force's effectiveness, and by disrupting the enemy's ability to coordinate their actions, Chen could multiply the effectiveness of her limited ammunition. The shot was followed by a significant change in the enemy's behavior. Instead of maintaining their positions and continuing to engage, they began what appeared to be a general withdrawal to more distant positions. Chun had succeeded in making the cost of continuing the engagement higher than the enemy was willing to pay. They're pulling back across the board, Rodriguez reported, excitement clear in his voice. We're getting periodic shots from long range, but nothing like the sustained fire we were taking earlier. You've broken their will to fight. Chen's 22nd and 23rd shots were placed into the enemy withdrawal routes, more to encourage their departure than to inflict specific casualties. She wanted to convince them that continuing to engage was futile, that every moment they remained in the area increased their own risk without improving their chances of success. Both shots struck in areas where the enemy had been observed moving, producing the satisfying sounds of impact and followed by increased urgency in the enemy's withdrawal. Chun was essentially conducting a masterclass in psychological warfare, using precision fire to convince a numerically superior force that discretion was the better part of valor. Outstanding work, Overwatch, Rodriguez called over the radio. Enemy forces are withdrawing to positions beyond effective engagement range. We're using this opportunity to establish a defensive perimeter and treat our wounded properly. Chen had 4 rounds remaining, and for the first time since the storm had engulfed them, she began to believe that all 8 SEALs might actually survive the engagement. The immediate tactical situation had stabilized, the enemy had been forced to abandon their aggressive posture, and the Americans now controlled enough terrain to defend themselves effectively. But survival and escape were 2 different things. The storm continued to rage, making extraction impossible and preventing reinforcements from reaching their position. The enemy had withdrawn, but not disappeared, and they would likely reorganize and return once they had time to develop new tactics and bring up additional resources. Chen's 24th shot was insurance, placed into an area where the enemy might establish long-range observation posts to monitor American activities. She wanted to discourage them from maintaining contact and encourage them to withdraw completely from the immediate area. The bullet struck rock and ricocheted with a distinctive whine, followed by the sound of someone scrambling for cover. Even if she hadn't scored a direct hit, Chen had made it clear that remaining in the area carried significant risks. With 3 rounds remaining, Chen faced a difficult decision. She could save the ammunition for a genuine emergency, or she could use it to further discourage enemy contact and ensure that the SEALs had maximum freedom of movement during the storm. Martinez settled the debate by pointing toward a position where he had observed muzzle flashes. There's still someone out there with a rifle, taking occasional shots at our people. If you can eliminate that threat, it would give them complete freedom to move and reorganize. Chen's 25th shot was aimed at the distant rifleman. The range was extreme, the conditions were impossible, and she had no clear target. But sometimes being a sniper meant taking the shot that needed to be taken, regardless of the probability of success. The bullet disappeared into the storm, and for several seconds, nothing happened. Then, the distant firing stopped completely, and Chen knew that her shot had found its mark. Whether she had eliminated the threat permanently or simply convinced the sniper that continuing to engage was too dangerous, the result was the same. "That's it," Rodriguez reported over the radio, and Chen could hear the relief in his voice. "All enemy fire has ceased. We have freedom of movement and the ability to establish proper defensive positions. Outstanding work, Overwatch. You just saved 8 lives." Chen had 2 rounds remaining in her rifle, but the immediate crisis had passed. The storm continued to rage around them, but the SEALs were no longer trapped in a deadly crossfire. They had breathing room, time to treat their wounded, and the opportunity to plan their extraction once visibility improved. As she settled back behind her cover to wait for the storm to pass, Chen reflected on the most challenging engagement of her military career. 25 shots fired blind into a sandstorm, each one a calculated gamble based on incomplete information and pure instinct. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it had. Martinez looked at her with undisguised admiration. "In all my years as a spotter, I've never seen anything like that. You just conducted a one-woman siege against a numerically superior force in conditions where most people couldn't hit a barn from inside it." Chun managed a tired smile despite the exhaustion that was beginning to overwhelm her. "We're not done yet. We still have to get everyone home alive. But at least now we have a fighting chance." The storm continued to howl around them, but for the first time in hours, it sounded less like a death sentence and more like the natural phenomenon it was. 8 men were alive who shouldn't have been, and 2 rounds remained in Chen's rifle for whatever challenges the desert might throw at them next. The silence that followed Chen's 25th shot was almost more unsettling than the chaos of the firefight had been. After nearly 2 hours of constant gunfire, explosions, and radio chatter, the sudden absence of enemy contact created an eerie calm that was broken only by the continuous howling of the sandstorm. Chen remained in her firing position, rifle ready, scanning the storm-shrouded battlefield for any sign that the enemy might be regrouping for another assault. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, muscle memory keeping her weapon oriented toward the most likely threat directions, even though she couldn't see more than a few meters through the swirling sand. Martinez had moved to a position where he could monitor multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, tracking communications from the SEAL team, the forward operating base, and aviation assets that were circling helplessly above the storm, waiting for visibility to improve enough to provide support. Command is reporting that satellite imagery shows the storm system beginning to weaken on its western edge. Martinez called over to Chun, his voice barely audible over the wind. But the meteorology section estimates we've still got at least 90 minutes before visibility improves enough for air operations. 90 minutes might as well have been 90 hours given their tactical situation. The SEALs were alive and no longer under immediate attack, but they remained isolated in hostile territory with limited ammunition and wounded personnel who needed medical attention that couldn't be provided in field conditions. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with a situation report that confirmed Chen's concerns. Overwatch, we've consolidated our position and established a defensive perimeter. Thompson's leg wound is more serious than initially assessed. He's lost significant blood and needs a surgical intervention within the next few hours. Williams took shrapnel to the shoulder but is still combat effective. Johnson has a concussion from the initial explosions but is functional. 3 wounded out of 8 was a casualty rate that could have been much worse, but it also meant that the team's combat effectiveness was significantly reduced. More concerning was Thompson's condition. Leg wounds that resulted in significant blood loss could quickly become life-threatening without proper medical care. Chun keyed her radio. Rodriguez, what's your ammunition status? There was a pause before the team leader responded, and Chun knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. We're down to about 30 rounds total, mixed rifle and pistol ammunition. Enough for self-defense, but not enough for a sustained engagement if they come back with reinforcements. The mathematics of their situation were stark. 8 men, 30 rounds of ammunition, wounded personnel, and an unknown number of enemy forces somewhere in the surrounding desert who had every reason to want revenge for the casualties they had suffered. If the enemy regrouped and returned with additional fighters and heavy weapons, the outcome would be predetermined. Chen's 2 remaining rounds suddenly took on enormous significance. They weren't just ammunition. They were insurance against the possibility that everything she had accomplished in the past 2 hours could be undone by poor timing or bad luck. The storm continued to rage with undiminished fury, creating a sensory deprivation environment that was psychologically as well as physically challenging. The constant noise made communication difficult and masked sounds that might indicate approaching threats. The reduced visibility eliminated the visual cues that soldiers relied on for situational awareness. The blowing sand created physical discomfort that made concentration increasingly difficult. Martinez had been monitoring enemy radio frequencies when possible, trying to gather intelligence about their intentions and capabilities. I'm picking up intermittent communications in Arabic, he reported. Can't understand the content, but the tone suggests they're discussing options rather than executing immediate plans. This was potentially encouraging news. If the enemy was still planning rather than moving, it suggested that Chen's fire had disrupted their operations enough to force them into a reactive posture. They were no longer driving the tactical situation. Instead, they were responding to developments initiated by the American forces. Chun used the lull in activity to address practical concerns that could become critical if the engagement continued. Her rifle had been exposed to sand and wind for over 2 hours, and despite her efforts to protect it, the harsh conditions were taking a toll on its mechanical reliability. She field-stripped the weapon as much as possible under the circumstances, cleaning sand from the bolt and chamber while keeping one eye on the surrounding terrain. The process was made more difficult by the need to prevent additional sand from entering the rifle's action during the cleaning process. "How's the weapon holding up?" Martinez asked, recognizing what she was doing. "It's functional, but I can feel the sand in the action," Chen replied, working carefully to remove grit from the rifle's moving parts. "The last 2 rounds will fire, but I can't guarantee it will function properly after that if we get into an extended engagement." This was another factor that worked against them in any prolonged confrontation. While the enemy could presumably resupply their forces with fresh weapons and ammunition, the Americans were limited to whatever they had carried into the battle. Equipment failures could be as dangerous as enemy fire under these circumstances. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the forward operating base. All stations, this is Base Command. Weather reconnaissance indicates storm intensity is beginning to decrease. Estimated time for helicopter operations is 60 to 90 minutes. Ground convoy is standing by, but cannot move until visibility improves. 60 to 90 minutes was still a significant period to maintain security in hostile territory, but it represented the first definitive timeline for extraction that they had received. Chun felt a slight easing of the tension that had been building in her chest since the engagement began. Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and began coordinating with Chun about security during the extraction period. Overwatch. When the helicopters arrive, we're going to need you to provide security overwatch during the loading process. That's when we'll be most vulnerable to enemy fire. Chin understood the tactical situation perfectly. Helicopter extractions were inherently dangerous because the aircraft were vulnerable to ground fire. The loading process required personnel to move in the open, and the noise of the helicopters would announce their location to any enemy forces in the area. Copy that, Rodriguez. I'll maintain overwatch until you're airborne. Do you have a landing zone selected? Affirmative. We've identified a flat area about 200 meters north of our current position that should accommodate 2 UH-60s. We'll move to that location when we get word that the birds are inbound. Chun studied the terrain in that direction, though visibility remained too poor to see the actual landing zone. She would need to position herself to cover the movement from the sealed position to the landing zone, as well as the loading process itself. With only 2 rounds remaining, she would have to choose her targets very carefully if enemy forces appeared during the extraction. Martinez had been tracking the storm's progress using weather data transmitted from the command post. Wind speeds are down to 40 knots from the peak of 65 knots an hour ago, he reported. Visibility is still near zero, but the rate of improvement is increasing. This was the most encouraging news they had received since the storm began. Decreasing wind speeds meant that helicopter operations would become possible sooner, and improving visibility would restore their ability to identify threats before they became immediate dangers. Chen's radio earpiece crackled with a new voice, one she recognized as Major Williams from the command post. Overwatch, this is Base Command. Outstanding work today. When you get back, I want a full debrief on your engagement techniques. What you accomplished out there shouldn't have been possible under those conditions. The recognition was gratifying, but Chen was more focused on ensuring that there would actually be a debrief session. The engagement wasn't over until everyone was safely back at the base, and she had learned never to celebrate until the mission was completely finished. Thank you, sir. Just doing my job. We'll worry about debriefs after everyone is home safe. The next 30 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The storm continued to weaken gradually, but visibility remained severely limited. Radio communications with the SEAL team confirmed that Thompson's condition was stable, but not improving, and that the team was ready to move to the landing zone as soon as aircraft were inbound. Chen used the time to study the terrain as much as possible through brief clearings in the storm. She identified potential enemy approach routes, calculated firing solutions for the most likely threat directions, and mentally rehearsed the movements she would need to make to provide effective overwatch during the extraction. At 1,730 hours, exactly 3 hours after the storm had first engulfed them, Martinez pointed toward the western horizon. I think I can see blue sky out there. The storm front is definitely moving past us. Chen looked in the same direction and could indeed make out patches of clear air in the distance. The wall of sand that had defined their world for the past 3 hours was beginning to break up, revealing glimpses of the desert landscape beyond. The radio came alive with coordinated transmissions as various elements began preparing for the extraction operation. Flight of 2 UH-60s is airborne and en route. Estimated arrival in 15 minutes. Ground convoy is moving to backup extraction point in case primary landing zone is compromised. Rodriguez's voice carried renewed energy as he coordinated his team's movement to the landing zone. Overwatch, we're beginning movement to the pickup point now. Visibility is still poor, but we can navigate by compass bearing. Maintain security on our movement and be ready to engage any threats that appear during extraction. Chun settled into her final firing position of the engagement, rifle loaded with her last 2 rounds and oriented toward the most likely enemy approach routes. Martinez took position as her spotter, ready to identify targets and call corrections if needed. The SEALs began their movement toward the landing zone, a tactical bound that would take them through open terrain where they would be vulnerable to enemy fire if anyone was still in position to engage them. Chun tracked their movement through her scope, ready to provide covering fire if needed. The sound of approaching helicopters became audible over the diminishing storm winds, a deep rhythmic thumping that announced the arrival of salvation for 8 men who had spent the afternoon fighting for their lives in impossible conditions. Chun kept her finger near the trigger, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her 25 shots fired blind into a sandstorm would be remembered as one of the most remarkable feats of marksmanship in military history, or as a desperate effort that ultimately fell short of saving the lives that depended on her skill. The helicopters were 3 minutes out, the SEALs were moving to the landing zone, and Chun had 2 rounds left to deal with whatever final challenges the desert might present. The storm was ending, but the mission wasn't over yet. The sound of the approaching helicopters grew louder as the storm continued to weaken, and Chun could finally see the SEAL team moving across the desert floor toward the designated landing zone. Through her scope, she watched 8 figures bounding by pairs across the open ground, their movements professional despite the exhaustion that 3 hours of combat had inflicted on all of them. Thompson was being assisted by 2 of his teammates, his wounded leg making independent movement difficult. Even from her elevated position, Chun could see that he was struggling, and she knew that getting him medical attention quickly was now the critical factor in the mission's success. The lead helicopter appeared first as a dark shape against the lighter sand, flying low and fast toward the landing zone. The pilot was clearly skilled, maintaining formation despite visibility that was still marginal and wind conditions that would challenge any aircraft. Chun tracked the helicopter's approach through her scope while simultaneously scanning for any signs of enemy activity. The departure of American forces would be exactly the kind of target that enemy fighters would try to exploit, hoping to inflict casualties during the vulnerable extraction process. Martinez had established communication with the helicopter flight leader and was providing wind and visibility updates. Visibility improving rapidly, he reported over the radio. Wind from the southwest at 35 knots, gusting to 45. Landing zone is secure. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of sand and dust that momentarily reduced visibility to near zero around the landing zone. Chun could hear the engines spooling up to maintain power while the aircraft was on the ground, ready for immediate departure once the passengers were loaded. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio, professional despite the urgency of the situation. Beginning loading sequence. Priority medical evacuation for Thompson. All other personnel combat ready. This was the moment Chun had been preparing for. The loading process would take approximately 90 seconds, during which time the SEALs would be completely vulnerable to enemy fire. The helicopters would be stationary targets, and any enemy forces in the area would have a brief window to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. Through her scope, Chun could see the SEAL team emerging from the dust cloud around the first helicopter, moving quickly but carefully as they helped Thompson into the aircraft. The professionalism of their movements was impressive even under these circumstances, each man knowing exactly what needed to be done and executing his role perfectly. The second helicopter was approaching the landing zone when Martinez grabbed Chen's arm and pointed toward a ridge line approximately 800 meters to the southeast. Movement on that ridge. Looks like vehicles. Chun swung her rifle toward the indicated direction and immediately saw what had alarmed her spotter. 3 pickup trucks were moving rapidly along the ridge line, and she could see armed figures in the back of each vehicle. The enemy hadn't withdrawn after all. They had repositioned and were now attempting to engage the helicopters during the extraction. Contact southeast. Chun called over the radio while settling into her firing position. Enemy vehicles approaching the landing zone. Estimate 12 to 15 personnel with crew-served weapons. Rodriguez's response was immediate and calm despite the implications of Chen's report. Copy contact southeast. Continue loading sequence. Overwatch, engage, and suppress hostile forces. Chen had 2 rounds remaining in her rifle, and she was facing a minimum of 12 enemy fighters who were rapidly closing on a position where they could engage the helicopters with devastating effect. The mathematics were impossible, but sometimes impossible situations required impossible solutions. Her first shot was aimed at the lead vehicle, specifically at what appeared to be a heavy machine gun mounted in the truck bed. The range was extreme, the target was moving, and the wind conditions remained challenging despite the storm's weakening. She made her calculations quickly, led the target to account for its movement, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the vehicle somewhere near the machine gun position, and Chun could see immediate results. The truck swerved violently and stopped, with figures scrambling to dismount. Whether she had hit the weapon, the gunner, or just the vehicle itself, she had eliminated the most dangerous immediate threat to the helicopters. But 2 more vehicles continued their advance, and Chen could see muzzle flashes as the enemy fighters began engaging the landing zone with automatic weapons. The range was still too great for their fire to be accurate, but that would change rapidly as they closed the distance. The second helicopter had landed and was beginning its loading sequence when Chun fired her final round. This shot was aimed at the lead vehicle of the remaining 2 trucks, hoping to disable or delay their advance long enough for the extraction to be completed. The bullet struck the vehicle's windshield, and Chun could see the truck veer off course before coming to a halt. The remaining enemy fighters dismounted from both vehicles and began advancing on foot, but their progress would now be much slower and would give the helicopters time to complete the loading and depart. Chen's rifle was now empty, her magazine completely expended after 27 shots fired under some of the most challenging conditions any sniper had ever faced. She had no more ammunition, but she had bought the critical time that the extraction needed. Both helicopters loaded and ready for departure. Rodriguez reported over the radio. All personnel accounted for. Overwatch. We are departing the area now. Chen watched through her scope as both helicopters lifted off from the landing zone, rising quickly to escape the range of small arms fire from the advancing enemy forces. The distinctive sound of their rotors began to fade as they gained altitude and distance from the battlefield. Martinez was already packing their equipment for their own extraction, which would come via ground convoy once the helicopters had cleared the area. 27 shots, he said, shaking his head in amazement as he helped Chun secure her rifle. 27 shots fired blind into a sandstorm, and you managed to suppress an entire enemy force and save 8 lives. They're going to study this engagement at sniper school for the next 50 years. Chun was too exhausted to feel much of anything except relief. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the engagement was beginning to wear off, leaving behind the physical and emotional fatigue that came after any intense combat experience. She had accomplished something remarkable, but the cost in stress and mental energy had been enormous. The radio crackled with confirmation that both helicopters were clear of the immediate area and en route to the forward operating base, where Thompson could receive proper medical treatment. The mission was finally, officially complete. Overwatch, this is Rodriguez. The SEAL team leader's voice came through her earpiece one final time. I don't know how you did what you did today, but 8 American families are going to have their loved ones come home because of your shooting. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you. Chun keyed her radio for the last time during the engagement. Just glad everyone made it out, Chief. Get Thompson to the medics and tell him that leg better heal up properly. We might need him for the next impossible mission. The ground convoy arrived 30 minutes later, emerging from the dissipating storm like ships appearing through fog. Chun and Martinez loaded their equipment and climbed into the armored vehicle that would take them back to the base, leaving behind a battlefield where one woman with a rifle had changed the course of what should have been a massacre. During the ride back to base, Chun stared out at the desert landscape that was gradually emerging as the storm moved further east. The terrain looked peaceful now, giving no indication of the life and death struggle that had taken place there just hours earlier. Martinez broke the silence that had settled over them. "What are you thinking about?" Chun considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about how many things had to go exactly right for this to work out the way it did. The storm that trapped us also prevented the enemy from bringing up reinforcements. My rifle held together despite conditions that should have made it unreliable. The enemy made tactical mistakes that gave me targets to engage. Rodriguez and his team kept fighting when most people would have given up." She paused, watching the base perimeter come into view in the distance. "I'm thinking about how fine the line is between success and disaster in combat operations. If any one of a dozen factors had been different, we'd be planning memorial services instead of debriefs." The convoy passed through the base entrance, and Chun could see personnel gathering near the medical facility where Thompson would be treated. Word of the engagement had clearly spread, and she realized that her anonymity as just another soldier was probably over. Major Williams was waiting for them at the convoy's destination, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal relief. "Outstanding work out there, both of you. Thompson is going to be fine, by the way. The medics say he'll be back to full duty within 6 weeks." Chun nodded, glad to hear that her efforts hadn't been in vain. "What's the intelligence assessment of enemy casualties, sir?" Williams consulted a folder he was carrying. "Based on aerial reconnaissance conducted after the storm passed, we estimate between 8 and 12 enemy Kia, with an unknown number of wounded. More importantly, we recovered significant intelligence materials from the vehicles they abandoned during their withdrawal. This was a major disruption to their operational capabilities. The numbers were gratifying, but Chun knew that the real measure of success wasn't enemy casualties, but American lives saved. 8 SEALs had entered a trap that should have killed them all, and 8 SEALs had walked away alive. Everything else was secondary. Over the following days, as Chun completed the extensive debriefing process and wrote her after-action reports, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. Military analysts called it one of the most remarkable demonstrations of precision marksmanship under adverse conditions in modern military history. The engagement would be studied, analyzed, and used as a training example for years to come. But for Chun, the technical aspects of the shooting were less important than the human element. She had proven that sometimes one person in the right place at the right time, with the right skills and the willingness to take incredible risks, could make a difference that rippled through dozens of lives. The letters from the families of the 8 SEALs began arriving within a week. Parents, wives, children, and siblings writing to thank her for bringing their loved ones home alive. Martinez's wife sent a photograph of their newborn daughter with a note saying that she would grow up knowing about the woman who made sure her father came home. Thompson sent his own letter from the hospital, written in the careful handwriting of someone whose dominant hand had been affected by his wound. "The leg is healing well," he wrote. "But more importantly, you gave me the chance to heal it. That's a debt I can never repay, but I wanted you to know that I'll never forget what you did for all of us that day." Chief Rodriguez submitted a recommendation for Chun to receive the Silver Star, the military's 3rd highest decoration for valor in combat. The recommendation was approved at every level of command, and the citation read in part, "Staff Sergeant Chin's exceptional marksmanship and tactical judgment under impossible conditions directly saved the lives of 8 American servicemen and disrupted enemy operations in a strategically important area." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow snipers, who began referring to the engagement as Sandstorm. In a tight-knit community of military marksmen, having an engagement named after you was the highest form of professional respect. Years later, when Chun had retired from active duty and was teaching marksmanship at a civilian training facility, students would ask her about the Sandstorm engagement. She would tell them that the technical aspects of the shooting were important, but that the real lesson was about making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. The storm took away everything I'd been trained to rely on, she would explain. I couldn't see my targets, couldn't calculate wind drift properly, couldn't even confirm that I was shooting at enemies rather than friends. But sometimes being a sniper means taking the shot when logic says it's impossible, because the alternative is watching good people die. The desert had tested her in ways that no training scenario could replicate, and she had proven that sometimes courage and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds. 27 shots fired blind into a sandstorm had become 27 reasons why 8 families didn't have to plan funerals. The story of that day would live on in military history, but for Chun, it would always be personal. It was the day she learned that being a sniper wasn't just about shooting straight. It was about being willing to take responsibility for other people's lives when the stakes were highest and the odds were longest. The storm had passed, but its lessons would last forever.